This lectures on ethics in the medical field. It's required that you get some ethics training in by the NACLS Curriculum Development Committee. So therefore, we're going to cover the basics of ethics and how it applies to the medical field. So ethical questions are characterized by some pretty basic similarities. They often start with words or involve words like ought or should, and they imply basically that some kind of decision has to be made. Generally speaking, to any ethical question, there are going to be several alternate solutions, and there's nothing to say that any one of those solutions doesn't have some maybe problematic issue or some challenging aspect to it. They also frequently contain conflicting moral choices or dilemmas, and those will reflect the underlying values of the community or the culture in which they arise. Ethical questions don't necessarily have a right or wrong answer that will satisfy everybody. They generally, the way you answer an ethical question, generally what you're looking at does it have a better or a worse answer? And that would be based on some kind of well-reasoned justification. The point of of an ethical question is to get to the best possible answer for the most possible situations. Now, when you're looking at an ethical question, it's important that you have to, in order to answer an ethical question, that you have to gather as many facts as possible before you actually make a decision about the ethical question. The ethical questions that arise in any society and in any industry, including the medical industry, arise because we have a responsibility to others in our community. Whether it's others in the medical community or as a medical community to others in the community at large. And the reason we have a responsibility is because we know that our behavior will influence other people, their welfare, their overall happiness and well-being. That's going to be influenced by the decisions that we make. In the medical field, it's definitely much more it can be much more personal because it can affect literally the health of another person, another family, or the entire community. Now, when we look at an ethical question, we have to look at the values that we are going to espouse to answer that ethical question. And this was what I was talking about a little bit, how do we know it's an ethical question? Well, if there is some kind of struggle in coming to an answer because of those moral choices, those dilemmas, well, then you have to consider what values create the backbone of a moral question. And so the values that we're going to look at are these 6 principles, these 6 values that have been defined when we talk about trying to make decisions when it comes to medical ethics. Okay, these are the principles that we apply specifically to medical ethics. There might be other values that you would apply to other areas of ethics, and maybe you wouldn't necessarily have as much of one or another of these when it comes to another area of ethics, but these are the 6 principles that the values that we're most interested in when we talk about medical ethics. The first one being beneficence, which is basically do no harm. This is the basics of all medical care. Is we're the first and foremost, we want to do no harm, or non-malfeasance, as we talk about over here. We want to be acting in the best interests of the patient primarily. So put the patient in the center of everything that we do. Okay, so that's going to be hopefully the first thing, the first value that we're going to come to. But we also have to remember that there are other values to balance, and those include things like autonomy, where the patient really should be the ultimate decision maker, using the information that comes from us, the medical community, the clinical community. The patient really does still maintain the right to choose, the right to refuse or accept whatever options that we're giving them. Then also justice is important, and probably one of the things that becomes glaringly lopsided in the medical community today, and that is who gets which treatments. Is there a large, is it based solely on the merit of their illness, their insurance, their ability to pay, their geographical location? All of these things come into play, and really optimizing justice and making sure that we would prefer that the treatment is based solely on the illness that calls for it instead of all of the other factors. Then also dignity, that's also a principle of medical ethics. We're looking to ensure that the patient, as well as the rest of the medical community, the doctor, and all the rest of the clinicians, have the right to dignity. And when we're talking about dignity, to remember the humanness and the importance of the individual person, and to value the things that they value, which aren't necessarily on this list. So allowing that person to have dignity, the dignity of their own convictions, of their own values, is important. It can be a problem in the medical community. The doctor knows what's right. Well, sometimes what the doctor is espousing is not what the person believes in. And so you have that conflict. And we always have to remember that really we have to stick to that person's values, understanding them. And we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, of course, honesty, truthfulness, honesty, being as clear with our patients as we possibly can, knowing the whole truth about the illness and the treatment, that you don't leave anything out. That's the best way for our patient to make an informed decision. A physician or a clinician who keeps information back from a patient really isn't allowing them autonomy. They're not really giving them all the information so that they can make an informed decision. These are the values that have been determined to be the utmost in medical ethics. Now, don't get me wrong. This is as a industry, these are the values that we are supposed to espouse. There may be other values that are just as important to you or to another clinician, to another doctor, to another hospital. And those values aren't necessarily going to be lost just by espousing these 5 particular values. Okay, when we know what the values are behind medical ethics, then we can be able to balance these values. You have to find, sometimes doing no harm might, to the patient, acting in the best interest of the patient might take away from their dignity in some way. And there's definitely the treating people against their will. Children, for example. The child does not have a right to choose the same way that an adult does. So acting in the best interest of a child might look different than acting in the best interest of an adult. Okay? And balancing all of these values becomes a sticky situation in many cases. Okay? These values that we can look at, define, relate to our question are not necessarily the same as the values, morals, or ethics that our patients have. Okay, Sometimes you get a patient who comes in and says, I don't want to know from nothing, just give me the pills. Okay, they're making a choice there. They're asking you not to be honest with them, maybe. Don't tell me everything. Is there a way to allow that patient to fit into the values that we espouse as a medical community? Hopefully, by looking at, by balancing between all of these, we can come away with, an answer that, just because the patient doesn't want to know doesn't mean that the doctor has to give up his desire or her desire to share and include the patient in the decision making, um, which most physicians would like. Nobody wants to be the one to make the decision for another person. It can be a sticky situation. So if we look at some examples of some questions that might come up, some ethical questions, should, would, ought these things occur, we can decide, well, is the question even an ethical question? And this is just a list of some basic questions that might be applied to the medical community, and we can look at these and decide, is this an ethical question, or is it some other kind of question? So if you look at these, is it legal to sell human kidneys in the United States? How does a kidney function inside the body? What does my religion say about whether or not it is acceptable to donate a kidney? There's a whole bunch of different types of questions. These all might actually come to a physician. So looking at them, well, which ones are ethical? Which ones might take a little bit more time um, to discuss with a patient, to discuss with other physicians to come to an ethical conclusion. Look at the first one. Is it legal to sell human kidneys in the United States? That's not really an ethical question. If you're specifically asking if it's legal, that's a legal question. Okay, it either is or isn't. The answer is either yes or no. It's not. It either is or isn't legal to sell human kidneys in the United States. How does the kidney function inside the body? That's not an ethical question. That's a how. That's a scientific question. Okay, so we can explain factually to our patient how a kidney functions inside the body. What does my religion say about whether or not it is acceptable to donate a kidney to donate a kidney? Well, again, this is not an ethical question. What does my religion say? Well, your religion says something. Potentially, it says nothing, depending on the religion. But either your religion has something to say upon this, or it doesn't. So this is more of a factual thing. We can refer to the religion and get a definitive answer. Should individuals who donate a kidney choose who their organ should go to? This is a different question. Is this right? This is where you're trying to apply some value set to an action. And this is definitely an ethical question. Okay. What type of diet allows for the best athletic performance? Again, this is a scientific question. You can do explorations through experiments and stuff and come to an answer. Not necessarily the same answer every time, but still you're talking about empirical data that you can collect for this. Is killing someone always illegal? Again, a legal question. You're talking about legalities. It either is or isn't. This is a yes or no kind of question. And again, it can be sticky. There can be various ways of killing somebody, and illegality can apply differently to them. But the answer is still either yes or no. Should people select the sex of their child in advance? Again, now here we go. This is an ethical question. It doesn't ask, is it possible to select the sex of your child in advance? It's asking to place value. There's some value that has to be placed upon this activity. Same-sex marriage is constitutional. This is a yes or no question. You can see what we're doing here. Most appropriate way to worship. This has to do with, this is a religious or a cultural question. Is there a value associated with it? Yes, but that value is defined within the strict constructs of cultural norms. Okay, and do kidneys taste good? This is an opinion question. So you're asking for a yes or no question, not an ethical question. So the only ethical questions in this list here would be, the ethical questions would be D and G with the should questions. So the values, these principles that we talked about before, the values that we espouse in bioethics or in medical ethics, whichever way, what we're talking about are these 5 values that have been deemed to be important in the medical field. There are some, if you go to a different field, for example, bioethics, the principles that are espoused in bioethics, a little bit less. In bioethics, they're very interested in autonomy, respecting the rights of the person. Or actually that would be dignity, let's say, respect for persons. They're definitely interested in maximizing in beneficence or non-malfeasance, same basic, 2 sides of the same coin. And they're very interested in being fair. Bioethics, as far as an individual person making a choice, that might not necessarily be involved, because bioethics has a lot more to do with research, and so it's usually not talking about a clinical situation. Same thing with honesty. I would hope that honesty is important to every area of ethics, but it's not necessarily an individual principle. With the medical ethics, the reason we really add honesty as a value has to be that in order to make a decision, because we espouse autonomy, in order to make a decision, the patient really needs all of the information. And if we don't give them all of the information, we're not really being completely honest with them. So just to give you an example, I had a physician tell me that a surgery I was going through is easy peasy, in and out. And so make my decision about how good that surgery is going to be. Finish up the surgery. I think he might have been talking about himself, because by the time he finished with me, the amount of pain I was in, I couldn't walk for 3 days. Now that's not that I didn't have that information to be able to make the decision about that surgery. At the very least, I would have maybe not scheduled it for the day before I go to work. So these are the kinds of things when we're talking about honesty, you got to make it easy for a person to make a decision. Okay, even if I judge the surgery to be important to me, I need to be able to make a complete and full decision that will fit in for my entire life. Okay. So again, just to review what the values mean, autonomy is the patient being the person to make the decision for themselves. Autonomy is not exclusively meant for the patient, although because the patient is at the top of the pyramid in the medical world, their autonomy is paramount. But each individual within the medical field also has autonomy. Okay, so you as a medical laboratory scientist should not be, forced to, let's say, perform some service that you find morally repugnant, or forced to work in some way that you find that is contrary to your moral beliefs. Okay, so all of these things have to come into play. And honesty, the same way. While we have to be 100% honest with the patient, we expect the patient to be 100% honest with us. We don't always get that, but we do expect the patient to be 100% honest with us. It does have to be a two-way street in order for it to work 100% of the time. Dignity, we expect to treat our patients with dignity, and we do need to expect that our patients and the rest of the community treat each other within it with dignity. beneficence and justice the same. You know, treating, making sure that we're not trying to hurt the physician. There should not be an adversarial relationship between the patient and the physician. And in some cases, unfortunately, there may be. Same thing with justice. You shouldn't feel that that you're being set up by a patient. And unfortunately, historically, things like that do happen. So when we talk about probably the most important activity that you can do when you're trying to come to an ethical decision is really collecting the facts, because when we're talking about getting all that information, you need to have all the facts, just the facts, please. I'm dating myself there. So when we talk about facts, it's important for us to realize the difference between subjective and objective, which I know you know what these words mean, but to reiterate, when you're talking about ethics, making sure that we reiterate to ourselves what the definition of these are, so that when we're analyzing the facts, we know, all right, we're making an objective decision here. When something is subjective, that subjective thing really is more either a preference or an opinion of, it might even be the opinion of everybody, but it's still an opinion. You know, everybody might agree that life is better than death, but that's not a measurable, necessarily easily measurable decision. For some people, as you may have heard, some people have decided that they would prefer death over life. And is that something that we need to include? Is that a legitimate fact that we need to include while we're weighing our decisions? Okay. So just if you trying to decide how close you are to it, you know, sometimes it's very easy. So we're looking at the picture, the cartoon here, where you have the people eating, and we see a subjective decision. Do you like this piece of cake? So the young lady loves the cake, the young man hates the cake. That's a subjective decision. Some people don't like cake, okay? However, if we look at the second side, objectively, how many, whatever those things, tomatoes or oranges, are there? There are 4 oranges there. That's an objective, measurable opinion. Can you mesh the two? Yes, it's possible. Can we figure out how many people love cake? Well, we can count how many people love cake, and we can turn something that's subjective into something slightly more objective. We can determine preference, the number of preference. And so we need to make sure that we're sticking towards the objective as often as possible. Okay. If we look at the scale, this is basically what we want to do when we're looking at the facts that we're trying to acquire for our decision making. Purely subjective versus that should say purely objective, where it's all fact. This is not my cartoon, but hey, it's wrong. I could probably make my own number line. So on the one side, here you have all opinion is purely subjective. Here, this would be purely objective. Okay, I can't write with this. So this should be objective. That's terrible. Anyway, so purely objective, where it's all fact. So when you're trying to make a decision, you have to sort of determine, with the facts that you're gathering, are they how close are they to either side of this number line? Okay, so for example, if we wanted to ask a question, what's the capital of California? Well, we could get 8 different answers potentially from everybody in this room. If you all had to write down the capital of California on a piece of paper, hopefully all 8 answers will be correct, but all 8 might not be correct. And so we would then say, well, we have these different answers. How do we decide which ones are correct? Well, this is an objective decision. There's only one capital of California, and you either got it right or wrong. This is an objective decision. If, however, the question was something along the lines of, is California a nice place to live? Well, that's different. Again, we could have 8 different opinions on that, and many of the opinions might match. Yes, it's a nice place to live. No, it's not a nice place to live. In between, it doesn't matter if they match or not. They're still 100% opinion, okay, because that's your decision. Then you have other questions that might be in the middle, okay. Is the something along the lines of, does the amount of rain that's in California make it difficult to live? Well, the amount of rain ends up being a factual question. How difficult it is to live with that includes an opinion form, okay? And so then we're somewhere in the middle on this on that question. And so you have to be able to judge the questions that you're asking, which means the answers that you're getting. How far towards either end of this arrow of this line do they belong? Are they all subjective, or are they all objective? The reason that we need to get all that information is the purpose of or the goal in answering an ethical question really is to develop your justification for your answer. Remember, you're going to have more than one correct answer when you're talking about an ethical question. You need to choose one of them, however. There's very infrequently the choice, in some cases you might have the lovely choice of this, there's only 2 options, A or B. Great, there's only 2 choices, I only have to justify one or the other. So that sounds really good. Unfortunately, in most real ethical questions, you have a whole heck of a lot more than 2 options. You're only, however, going to be able to choose one. Your justification has to state why you chose that one. Okay, so you have to develop a position. If you have an excellent justification for this decision, in either case, whether you chose option A, or if it's only a 2 option case, or if you chose one out of many, your justification has to be clear. It has to start with a clearly stated position, and that position has to relate directly to that ethical question. I chose to treat the child with surgery because, so the question was, should we treat the child with surgery? The child objects, whatever the question was. You have to develop the position that includes the ethical question in it so that you're sure that you answered all parts of the question. So that's the whole goal. That's what the justification is. Part of the process of that justification, and which should be included in the justification, is that you have to use some objective data. Okay, these are the facts. So if you didn't collect the facts, so objective data, you have to use some kind of facts in your justification. Okay, so if you never collected anything and you didn't make sure that they were objective facts, then you would be unable to develop an acceptable justification for your answer. At the same time, again, an excellent justification is going to ensure that the patient autonomy and the patient dignity is maintained. Okay, so in the case of, for example, a child, how do we justify making a decision counter to a child's decisions? Well, the child is unable, doesn't have the experience, the brain formation, the the background in order to make these decisions. So we are going to use the decisions, we're going to use a group of people who do have that kind of background and experience in order to make that decision in lieu of the child's decision. We're recognizing their autonomy and their dignity, but also in part of their autonomy is their limitations, okay? So recognizing their limitations as well. And you also have to consider the other stakeholders and that's sort of at the bottom. You do have to address the dignity and the autonomy of all the other stakeholders. So in the case of child, well, we're talking about the parents. What do the parents need? What do the physicians need? The family, those are all stakeholders in that decision. So you have to address all of them in all aspects of this. You're going to have to reference the principles that you're following. So does this have to do with justice, autonomy, all those principles that you're using to justify your decision? And establish not just the strengths of your decision, but also the weaknesses. And that would include defining all the other options that were available. If you come to the conclusion that you do surgery on a child, well, what were the other decisions that could have been made? Was there, chemical therapy, physical therapy? What other kinds of decision, or even just let the child die? All these things are possible decisions that you could have made. You have to kind of weigh, be able to define what the pros and cons of each of those would have been if you had made those. Okay. So this is not just, you think about it, you ruminated on it over lunchtime and you come to an ethical decision. This is going to involve the input of many people in the field. Hopefully, if it's a well-defined justification. Okay. In the case of now we'd like to say that all ethical decisions are made with excellent justifications, with very strong justifications. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily always the case. In some cases, they're only using, I chose to, pull the plug because I really felt like that's what my father wanted. Well, that's not a strong justification. Did you know what the patient wanted? You can't just feel something. Weak justifications are based on subjective opinion and feeling. They're not substantiated with fact. And there might even be some bias that's involved in a weak justification, especially if it's some kind of cultural or personal bias. That's fairly weak justification. You really, again, what we're looking for is an answer that will be considered strong and well justified for the most, the largest group of situations. Not necessarily group of people, group of situations, okay? And then making sure that we have factual data and all that stuff to apply to it. The goal is that hopefully, you never know, but hopefully one of these choices that that you have to make here would be it would seem like the strongest choice once you gather all the facts and all the information. Now, the ethical issues that arise in healthcare, of course, there are many, and it really depends on the patient. But as a general rule, there are these 5 areas where definitely you have a significant balance of difficulty making ethical decisions. Okay, so if we start out with quality care versus efficiency of care, this is basically that cost versus quality question. Okay, how do we get everyone through the door of the doctor's office without limiting the doctor's time that he needs to spend with each patient? And that's just at the doctor's office. This is going to trickle through the entire healthcare system. Okay. So for you in the laboratory, for example, you're going to sit down at the bench and you're going to get, 50 specimens today. How are you going to get through those 50 specimens with the equal amount of care for each one. Quality care, right? So, for example, if you receive a body fluid count, body fluid counts, we generally look at body fluid counts. These are important, and we want to spend more time on them. Okay, you get a body fluid count at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At 1:02, 4 more come in the door behind them. Are you going to be able to spend an equally valuable amount of time, or the value that you want to associate with that specimen, on each one of them? Okay, maybe 5 isn't too hard, but what if 15 come in today? So this becomes the issue. Okay, if you look at it in a more general sense, for example, if let's say you provide parasite exams in the laboratory in Sloan Kettering. You maintain parasite exams, ova and parasite exam, in the laboratory in Sloan Kettering. Parasite exams happen to take a very long period of time. They're laborious, they take up a lot of tech time, and so cost-wise, they're expensive. Maybe you only do them once a month. Do I really need to keep that test in-house? Why don't I send them all out? Well, this is where you have to make an ethical decision. Is the benefit to the patient by reducing turnaround time because I can do it here more quickly than sending it out, which would necessarily make it take longer? Can I do it here more quickly and that would benefit the patient, or do I send it out? That's a question. Every test has to be applied to every test. Do we keep this test in-house? Is it valuable to our patients? Most tests are valuable to our patients. But if I don't order enough of them, is it worth keeping in-house? And that's something you have to answer for every single test done in-house. Okay. Look at the staff. Look at staff questions. A weekend shift. Weekend shifts, generally speaking, are a little bit slower in most areas of the lab than the day shift, the weekday shifts. So you say, well, should we really keep a full staff on, let's say, the weekend evening, or even just the evening? Do we really need to keep a full staff? Well, that's true. It's probably slower, but it's not always slower. And is it necessary, to the patient care that we keep a full staff? This can become an ethical question. Is there an ethical aspect to answering that question? Yes, there absolutely should be. It should not just be a cost answer to that. Another area that ethics comes into is in improving access to care, and this is definitely an issue that comes up again and again. Politically, it comes up, but also personally for your access to healthcare. That there's absolutely no doubt. I can't imagine anybody arguing with this, but the fact that the persons in our society at the bottom of the social economic totem pole, say, they have considerably less access to quality healthcare than those at the top. Okay, so the Bill Gates, the Donald Trumps of our society, they can purchase the healthcare that they want. They can afford the most expensive doctors, the most expensive hospitals, the most expensive tests. It doesn't matter to them, the little things. Whereas as you go down the socioeconomic ladder in our society, it's important to me that that the doctors that I choose are covered by my health care because I can't afford it. But I do have insurance, so that helps me out. So I still have a fairly good choice of physicians, hospitals, tests, and things that I can participate in. Go down farther down the ladder, a poor student who has either no health care or poor health care, well, maybe I'm stuck with the campus health care or, Medi-Stops or something like that. They're not necessarily terrible, but maybe I can't get the most expensive tests and the most expensive care. The best, which we generally associate with the best and the brightest. And then farther down the line, those who are on Medicaid or we've all heard about the VA, some of the care that's associated with that. Okay, look at Medicaid and Medicare, actually. There are many doctors who don't take it at all. Okay, hospitals are supposedly required to take it, but that practice actually is pretty much only applies to the ER. A hospital, you find they don't necessarily always get a bed in a hospital, in practice. Okay, um, and the answer to this question, the question is healthcare equally available regardless of the patient, or should healthcare be equally available regardless of the patient's wherewithal? That should be pretty easy to answer. Yes, it should be. The sticking point usually comes with how. If you have, doctors, there is a doctor, let's say a surgeon, there's a best surgeon in the area. She or he cannot see everybody. So how do you dole out? And the reality is, while we say, well, it probably should be the sickest should go to them, that's not necessarily the case. It's very rarely the case that the sickest go to them. Okay. So then you start asking, you start breaking down the question. You start saying, maybe a better question would be, well, which parts of the healthcare system should everyone have equal access to? If we say that, well, they should have equal access to every part of healthcare. Well, does that mean that everybody should get, plastic surgery? Everybody should get reproductive care? Everybody should get, I don't know, uh, you know, every aspect, does everybody get medical care, mental care, sorry, um, uh, all the time, or is there a limit to these things? The reality is we don't really have enough health care to give everybody everything. And that's the reality. So then you start to say, well, which parts do we have to provide for everybody? That's above my pay grade to answer necessarily. But you have to understand that the questions are being asked. Okay, and in the laboratory, there are tests that are not available to every insurance. And that's the reality. Not everybody can get every test. And so you have to be aware of which ones, or you should be aware that there is a limit. Ordering is not universal. A patient might not be able to pay for that. And so we have to consider the financial aspects of what our patient has to deal with as well. Okay. A thing that's coming up more recently, and that's because of the aging baby boomer generation, is really building and sustaining our workforce. Seems like that's probably sounds like more of a practical question, but there is actually an ethical component to that. As the baby boomers age and we get an older and older population, a larger and larger, I should say, older population, we're going to have more patients to care for as they age, with less young healthcare workers to care for them. Okay, remember that the majority of your healthcare occurs in the last year or two of your life. That's the majority of your healthcare for most people. So that's a lot of healthcare coming up, and we don't have the healthcare population to deal with that incoming population. Okay, so we need to address the process of retaining workers for as long as possible, and then also transferring the talent and experience that they have, the resources that are in that experienced healthcare staff, to the next generation, to a whole new generation of healthcare workers. And how do we do that ethically? Do we just, the people have heard on the news, here you got to train your replacement, you're out of here, here's your hat, what's your hurry? Don't let the door hit you, okay? We want to value the experience that exists in our workforce, but at the same time, we need that experienced workforce to be able to transfer that information that's in their brains to the next generation in a way that that values both the experienced generation as well as the up and coming generation. Okay. Probably one of the stickiest issues will always be the end of life issues. As I said, the end of a person's life is the most expensive part of any person's medical care as a general rule. And it's where you come in the closest contact with our industry, and usually for the longest period of the longest portion of your life. Okay. So how do we make decisions, not just medical decisions, but also financial decisions for this time in a patient's life? Okay, especially considering that the end of life frequently means that a person loses their autonomy. They're unable to make decisions for themselves. Okay, so if a person loses the ability to make their own decisions, which frequently happens at the end of life, who do we turn to? Who do we as an industry turn to? How do we figure out who we turn to? Those decisions have to be made hopefully before they lose their autonomy. Okay. And then where does the money come from? This is the most expensive point in a patient's life. And how do we pay for it? Do they have the money to pay for it? Geriatricians used to be, or physicians who take care of the geriatric population used to be a large specialty. You'll find almost nobody is a geriatrician anymore. And one of the major reasons is the money. It's a great big population, but the payment is terrible. If you're relying only on Medicare, you're not going to make enough money. Everybody who's over 65 is on Medicare at the very least. And unfortunately, we just went through this in our family when the person who is in hospice or who is dying finally dies. They just are left to the doctors and the hospitals, and they're all just left to pick over the bones of the person's financial remnants. They likely don't get paid. Okay, the end of life is the end of life. Okay. So this is definitely one of the stickiest parts. The point is, again, collect the facts, get the most objective information that you have for that person. I don't think that there's any way to make a single law to figure this out. But gathering the facts about that person, preferably before they lose autonomy, and then making decisions based on that. Probably one of the biggest parts is that people really don't like to make these decisions. So their autonomous decision is not to make a decision. And the reality is, when you do that, then you're asking somebody else to make it for you. Okay. And then another major area in the healthcare, major sticking point, another ethical question is allocation of limited resources. If you look at medication or vaccine shortages, for example, manufacturing can't always keep up with the demand. This could include medications, vaccines, equipment, even organs. Okay. So if there's suddenly a flu, this happened a couple of years ago. We had the flu epidemic in the area, and the flu vaccine production didn't go so well, and so we had a shortage of the flu vaccine. We have a flu epidemic every year. It was really the production of the vaccine. Production mechanisms for the flu vaccine are limited by nature. Okay, we can't streamline them very easily. And so we didn't have enough vaccine to go to all of the people that normally get the vaccine. And so how do we decide who gets it? Well, the decisions were made to prioritize those who are most at risk. The reality, though, is if you had the money to pay for the vaccine, you probably got it, whether you were at risk or not. Okay, so the goal was to prioritize those who are most at risk, but was that the end result of that goal? One of the things that's frequently left out of making those ethical decisions is to go back after the decision was made and to see if it actually followed through. Did we actually follow through with the justification that we made? Was that actually what was practically applied to the situation? And then equipment and research availability. How do we decide who gets what? Um, uh, in these cases, everybody has to be part of the decision-making process, including us in the laboratory, because, well, we have the information about the tests. We know best, you know, how far our equipment, how far our talents will go. Okay. Look at the kerfuffle over organ donations. You know, the question is, um, somebody needs a, say, liver transplant. Well, this person may be the sickest, their liver may have the shortest amount of time, when compared to, you know, person A's liver is about to go, person B's liver is not too far behind. So you might say, well, person A should get it, but person A is a lifelong alcoholic. Does that come into play? So these are all parts that really do, they're facts that have to be weighed in making the decision. Okay? No matter how ugly the answer is. So if we look at quality versus efficiency specifically, look at the staffing issues. We're looking just at staffing issues, specifically relating this to the clinical lab. Probably one of the biggest complaints in most laboratories is that we're understaffed. Okay, and this probably reflects the shortage of technologists that are in the industry. Okay, um, inadequate staffing of clinical um, laboratories could cause many different problems. It could compromise quality, it could compromise throughput, as well as it could increase the turnaround. You know, you can end up increasing turnaround times, which could then affect patient care. Now, on the flip side of that, what if we just you know, Sloan Kettering decides to increase their overall pay and just hire everybody they can? Well, excess staff might unnecessarily increase the cost of each individual test. So we need to balance that. Okay. At this point, though, most uh, hospitals are understaffed. They're missing some FTEs or full-time employees in any one department, and usually more than one department. Okay. Now this chart comes from um, a study that's done by CAP. I'm not sure if it's annually or semi-annually, but it basically is comparing the productivity as measured by billable tests. Okay, basically they look at how many tests you do, and then throws in the number of full-time employees over full-time management full-time employees to give you an idea of how much each tech is expected to do in each department, at the same time how many supervisors they'll have to manage them. So if we look at the chemistry department, for example, here, in the chemistry department, total billable tests per non-management full-time employees, 149. Non-management full-time employees to management is 146. Okay, so you can see what the mean is with the total number of tests of 149. The mean number of billable tests in chemistry, 48,000, which is the mean. The 90th percentile, the highest, the higher numbers that they get. Look over here, 90,000 billable tests. To the non-management, this is annually per non-management full-time employee. Okay, that's a lot of tests in a year. Okay, the lowest number would be 17,000, so that's a small country hospital here that you're seeing. So you can see that in chemistry. And each of the different sections will have microbiology or transfusion medicine, where it's a little bit more manual. You can see less tests overall, but each test you know, you could complain it takes more. Well, they broke it down between units transfused and then cross matches. depending on the type of hospital, these can have different numbers. You can see in small hospitals, very few units. Microbiology also more manual. You can see definitely a tighter. You can see the difference here. Okay, and you can see the N means how many institutions did you look at? 149 looks like it's about the top number, which just shows you probably every hospital that they looked at had a chemistry department. Not every hospital had a microbiology section or a blood bank necessarily, and not every hospital had a pathology, anatomic pathology section. Okay. This is just giving you the idea of what your workload is. What's the workload of the technologists? What are we asking them to do annually? One of the attempts that was done in order to try and allay this understaffing was to train generalists as opposed to a specialist. So a specialist is a technologist who works only in one particular field. A generalist is able to work in more than one field. Okay, generally speaking, the generalist will be able to cross over between hematology, chemistry, and then in some cases you might include blood bank, at least to a limited extent. Microbiologists are rarely generalists. They're usually, if you have a microbiology section in your hospital, they're usually specialists. And that's just because the training takes so much longer. And blood bank, if you do have a specialized blood bank, you usually will have at least some specialists. You might staff it with equal amounts of specialists and generalists in order to fit the need. A generalist would probably be able to do your ABO typing and cross-matching, but might not be able to do some of the more specialized tests that blood bank does. The idea behind this was that by training generalists, you could cover loss of productivity due to maybe sick days or vacation, as well as improve turnaround time by having technologists move from an area that's slower to an area that's being hit with more orders and more tests on any particular day. Okay. Unfortunately, by hiring and training only generalists, there is a certain amount of loss of specific technical knowledge and experience in the specialist area. If somebody was a hematology specialist, the amount of technical knowledge that they had would be considered more than a generalist in the same area. And that loss of that specific technical knowledge has been seen as risky for certain near-miss incidents or even for overall quality of care. And as well as there is with the generalist theme, there is a certain amount of morale issues that are associated with generalist training in the lab. Okay, as far as sort of a competitiveness or an adversarial relationship that can be set up between the management and the technologists, moving me around from place to place, that kind of thing. Then we also have to look at quality versus efficiency in the new graduate versus the experienced technologist. The inclination of any manager would be to have the cheapest possible staff that you can, and those would mean new graduates. They're the cheapest, that's the reality. You have to pay for experience. The problem is a new graduate literally has no experience, and there are many things that they're not aware of yet, and so they would miss them. And you'd see an increase if you only staffed with new graduates. You'd see an increase in either near miss or incidents in a laboratory that was new graduate heavy. So balancing and getting the information out of the heads of those with experience is an important thing to consider as you move through the staffing issues that affect the clinical lab. The next thing you do have to consider ethically is, okay, are we talking about full-time, part-time, per diem staffing? So we know what a full-time employee is in a hospital situation for the most part. As a general rule, it's considered 40 hours per week. In some hospitals, it might be 35. Some others, it might be a little bit more than that, up to 48. So it depends on the hospital and their policy. But we know what full-time, as a general rule, employee is. And the benefit of being a full-time employee, yes, you have to contribute the most number of hours, but you get the most benefits. Okay, you get usually full hospital benefits, full medical benefits, as well as full employment benefits to sick time, vacation time, holiday time, and all of the other things that come along with that. A part-time employee is usually some portion of that, whether it's 3/5, which is usually the limitation. So a person who's 3/5 time, meaning they work 3 out of the 5 days. In some hospitals, they allow part-time to be defined as 2/5, but most hospitals require it to be at least 3/5 in order to be considered a part-time employee. And they do have some benefits, but not all of the benefits that belong to an employee of the hospital. So the part-time employee might get some holiday, some sick time, but not full holiday or sick time. They might get some other benefits. They're not usually until they hit a certain level. Maybe they're not entitled to, say, retirement benefits, but they might be entitled to some other benefits, whether it's medical or insurance or something like that. And then you have the per diem. The per diem works literally per day or per diem. So they're usually less than 2/5, or either 2/5 or less type employee. And as a general rule, they don't get any benefits. They're not entitled to insurance. They're not entitled to holiday or vacation. They're not entitled to anything. The benefit to them usually is they work when they want and they can say no. Okay, full-time employee has to work, can't say no. Part-time employee usually can't say no too much, but they have some more flexibility. So making sure that you're allowing the employee to have a full role in determining their own status as an employee becomes an important part of being ethical when you're staffing your laboratory. Okay, having all full time is obviously the ideal. That's a great thing. They get full time and they get full benefits. However, that is difficult to do in this day and age, and sometimes hospitals need to fill in the little spots, especially vacations, holidays, and stuff like that, with per diems or part-timers. But moving a person from one position to another without their autonomy, remember autonomy, their own ability to make the decision, usually you're going to have some problem with justifying that decision. Now, access to care, obviously this is always going to be an issue. I think it's probably always going to be an issue in healthcare. In some data from the National Health Interview Survey from 2014, the percentage of adults without a usual place of medical care ranged from 2.8% in Vermont to 26.7% in Nevada. That's a pretty drastic difference. So the percentage of adults who did not have a general doctor visit in the past 12 months ranged from 15.9% in Vermont to 48.1% in Montana. Okay. Then more stats. The percentage of adults without a usual place of medical care was lower in states that had expanded Medicaid compared with non-expansion states. Interesting. Isn't that interesting? So it didn't seem to really work for those states. The percentage of adults without a usual place of medical care or who did not see a general doctor in the past 12 months was lower in states with partnership markets compared with federally facilitated marketplace states. So the mechanism of insurance, of healthcare insurance, which is generally speaking our method of access to healthcare, seems to definitely play a role in whether or not healthcare is accessible. Now, I just want to point out, when you're talking about that persons who without a usual place of medical care, ranging from 2.8% in Vermont, 26.7% in Nevada. One of the questions that you might ask here, are there more people in Nevada who don't care to go to the doctor? That might be true. So that might be playing a role. Percentage of adults who did not have a general doctor visit in the past 12 months, 15.9% in Vermont, 48% in Montana. Are there more people in Montana who probably said, I don't need to go to the doctor? That might be true. Okay, so you definitely have to roll that information into your facts, okay? But the key issue here is that when we're talking about insurance, that usually is the mechanism of our access to healthcare. So we need to make sure that we have some mechanism, some type of insurance, or we hope to have some type of insurance that allows equal access, whether you live in a big city where there's lots and lots of doctors, or if you live in rural, I don't know where this place is, okay? But obviously it looks like there might not be a doctor for a while in this place, okay? So those first statistics that I threw out there, there might be a lot of patient choice involved in those, but they did a little bit more digging and they asked more questions, and they found that in the 12 months prior to the interview that they used for this national health survey, and this next set of stats comes from the 2012 interview, they found that 2.4% of people in the U.S. had in the U.S. in general, had problems finding a general doctor, with 2.1% having been told that the doctor would not accept them as new patients. Could be that the doctor's full. And 2.9% have been told that the doctor did not accept their health care coverage. Okay, so their insurance was not made that physician unaccessible to them. So that's fairly low percentage still. Okay, not zero, but still fairly low percentage. When we look at people under the age of 65 who had public coverage, so you're talking about Medicaid patients, only those who had public coverage were more likely than those with private insurance with the three types of adverse experiences with physician availability. So we know, based on the interview from 2012, that having Medicaid, which is the insurance for those under the age of 65, those who have Medicaid were much more likely to have either inaccessible, the doctor isn't taking new patients, but more like the doctor does not take your insurance, okay, than those who have private insurance. Determining the equity of access to care is not limited, however, to payment, okay? When we look at who pays, whether it's the patient, an insurance company, or the state, that's definitely an issue. But we also have to think about how much should be paid. Salaries differ from state to state. Salaries are much higher here in New York than they are, say, in Kansas. Okay, so does that mean that reimbursement should differ? Should a physician who's doing a throat exam for somebody who's got a sore throat in New York get paid more than somebody who's doing a throat exam in Kansas? The throat exam is the same. The schooling that they went to is the same. Should it be different? Okay, these are all questions that have to be answered. And then who gets paid? Okay, so does the doctor get paid, the nurse? You've got a whole bunch of support staff behind every doctor or hospital visit. Okay, how much of that cost is going to be paid by your reimbursement? Okay, just letting you know, when you go in for a flu shot, the doctor gets paid about a quarter. That's what he gets paid. Okay, so the cost is definitely not covered for every visit that goes in. Okay, when you look at some of these visits, in particular for things like Medicare patients and stuff like that, it's not just the doctor visit that's covered. There are transportation costs and other costs that are also paid. And a friend of mine who's a doctor used to joke that the cab driver, the medical van driver, gets paid more than the doctor visit for the average Medicare visit. Okay, so if the average Medicare visit gets reimbursed, say $20, the cab driver gets 30, because cab drivers don't adjust their cost. It costs what it costs. Then you have to worry about everybody else too. What about home health care aides? What about laboratories like us? Okay, what kind of reimbursement do we get? And who's advocating for our reimbursement? And then what exactly are we paying for? Should every procedure be paid for? Okay, the throat exam, maybe we can all agree that that should be paid for. But what about other visits? If you have a patient who comes just because they're feeling poorly and there's nothing wrong with them, do we pay for every visit? How about the patient that goes to the emergency room with a headache? Do we have to pay for that visit too? Yep, at this point we do. And what are our priorities? Are vaccines more important than surgeries? Are more important than well visits? What's the most important? It to have some kind of priority, right? To figure out what should get paid for. And finally, of course, where should the money come from? At this point, most insurance is covered through your salary. Basically, it's a part of your salary. Okay, you pay your insurance. Your insurance is paid by your employer and yourself. It's part of your salary. It comes out of your income. But not just that, your taxes help to pay for Medicare and Medicaid. Should we change that? Should we create a new tax to cover all insurance? Should we create a VAT tax? Or should everybody just pay for their own? It's hard to answer that. All of these things have to come into play. What are your priorities? How does insurance work? Who gets paid? What personnel? What resources? What are the policies? How are we going to pay you? And then where does the money come from? That's always going to be an answer, a question that needs to be answered. Going back to that workforce, we know that we have data that's been released just this October 2016, which show higher vacancy rates as well as higher anticipated retirement rates compared to just 2 years ago. Okay, actually this information is 2015. Okay, so October 2015, we know that the vacancy rates as well as anticipated retirement rates much higher than 2 years ago. By department, chemistry has the highest percentage of employees anticipated to retire in the next 5 years at 23.6%. So nearly a quarter of our chemistry departments are going to turn over in the next 5 years. That's followed by hematology at 20%. Nearly 20% is going to turn over in the next 5 years. Microbiology is right behind hematology is 19.51. Microbiology is 19.48. So those are both as well as blood bank 19.9. Those are basically at 20%. They're going to turn over, pardon me, in the next 5 years. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had projected in 2014 that the U.S. would need 81,000 additional med techs and technicians to replace the retiring staff, and another 68,000 to fill newly created positions. So 81,000 just to replace what we already have. And then the anticipation of an increasing lab population because of the increasing aging population, another 68,000 to fill that. How many individuals do we have graduating each year from accredited training programs? 4,700. That's how many are graduating every year. This is why you guys were able to have this program, because there's not enough of you each year to fulfill the demand. Okay, so we have this clear demand for medical laboratory professionals, and that's growing. But the number of students graduating is declining. One of the major reasons is the programs are closing. Okay, the med tech programs are closing. Approximately the numbers that are out there now by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that we need to fill more than 7,000 jobs annually. But the programs are only producing, and that's the programs, both medical lab technologists and technicians, they're only producing about 6,000 qualified professionals each year. That's according to NACLS. Okay, so we're at 1,000. We're a deficit of 1,000 each year. Okay, now one of the problems with that isn't just that the 1,000 we're down 1,000 positions. That's going to lead to over the stress on the existing staff, right, by overworking them. It's going to lead to a limitation on how far you can expand your laboratories. It's going to lead to a loss of, as more retire than fill, a loss of experience. Okay, we lose that experience, we lose that knowledge. And also a loss of the ability to move people up into some kind of supervisory or management role. So who's going to be running these labs? Okay, it's going to produce an unhealthy reliance on instrumentation. Okay, instrumentation is a wonderful thing. It gets a lot done, but you can't have one tech running 4 machines. That's not wise. Okay, and so maintaining competency in the face of all this becomes a major problem for our workforce. Okay. Now here we go to end of life issues. This is probably the area that ends up being one of the stickiest areas, and we need to remember that all of the different foundations for medical ethics when we consider any one of these issues. Okay. Remember the pillars, right? We have autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, as well as justice, dignity, truthfulness, and honesty. And autonomy. Did I already say that? I think I already said that. So we want to make sure that we keep all of those in mind when we look at any of the end of life issues. Okay, and so these are just some of them. And this becomes a big part of what's going on at Sloan, because a lot of times cancer can be the end of life event for a person. Okay, so the question becomes, all right, you're treating a patient. When should we end treatment because we know that it's futile? That's a difficult question. If we are going to end treatment, what exactly should constitute palliative care? Palliative care meaning we're just trying to make a patient comfortable as they die. That's palliative care. Okay. Probably the biggest one is who gets to make the decisions when a patient can't. My parent, I have 7 brothers and sisters. God bless the doctor who has to deal with us when it's time to make decisions for either one or both of my parents. Okay. When the patient can't make the decision, who's the one who's going to decide? For the most part, hospitals encourage patients to produce healthcare practices, which will help to define the things, give you those solid facts so that we know what the patient wants, right? If we have a healthcare proxy, we know what the patient wants. But can a healthcare proxy expire? If I wrote out a healthcare proxy when I was 18, does that still count when I'm 68? Which healthcare proxy is more important? So all of these things have to be, making sure that some hospitals won't take one that's that old. But if it's the only one, isn't it good enough? Who knows? Okay, these questions have to be asked, and you have to justify your answers. Our legal guidelines, the legal guidelines that cover end of life, are those good enough? In most states, it is not legal for the medical community to assist a person to end their life. Regardless of moral stance, it's not legal. Okay. Is that good enough? Well, there's an awful lot of discussion over how that should change, if it should change. Okay. And then how do we support the family? And which members of the family get to decide? Okay, so in many cases, in some states, for example, Washington and such, a patient can decide that they don't want to continue treatment and that they want to die. They want medical assistance to die. Well, even in Washington, there is a limit, an age limit on that. But is that ethical? Should a 17-year-old be able to decide that they want to die? It has come up legally, they can't. Legally, in all states, they can't at this point. But that is also being discussed. And the ethical part of it has to rely on the moral. Can you force a physician to help you end your life? If you're the only doctor in, I don't know, backwoods Montana, and a patient comes to you, if it was legal in Montana, says, I want to end my life, can you say no? You couldn't say no if the patient wanted you to, if the patient had emergency care, you couldn't say no. Well, these are the lines that have to be defined. We don't want to have to deal with these when it comes to crisis. We want to ask and answer these questions in advance of a crisis. And again, one of the biggest sticking points will always be limited resources. And you can see here, this did come up a couple of years ago. We had a shortage of the flu vaccine, and this is one of the cartoons, which of course they were picking on Obamacare, but we really did have, had nothing to do with Obamacare, but we did have a shortage. There were manufacturing failures that occurred that limited the supply of the flu vaccine. And the limitation became known in September. That's too late to make more flu vaccine really on time. They were able to get more flu vaccine later on, but for some people, they need to receive the flu shot in September and October, so they're protected through the entire season. So it became prioritizing, and you can see this is the reality of limited resources. Okay, there was a shortage of INH, for example. INH is a medication. It's a first-line drug to treat TB, and in 2012, there was a shortage of INH. Again, you only have a couple of manufacturers of INH, which stands for isoniazid. Okay, there's only a couple manufacturers. So when in 2012 we had a significant shortage, that meant that there was a significant interference with patient care. When you go on this drug, you have to be on it for about a year. In most cases. So there had to be some decisions made. 79% of health departments had trouble getting, 79% had trouble getting INH for their TB population, their at-risk TB population. 15% ran out, absolutely ran out, which totally ruins patient care. Okay, you got to keep INH on board and at a level in order to keep TB from fulminating. And 41% of all health departments reported a supply limited to only 30 days. So it was a very serious shortage. So what were some of the things that we can do? Expanding the manufacturing base sounds like, well, why don't we just make more people make it? Well, there's not a lot of money in INH, okay? If you increase manufacturing base, you're going to actually reduce the amount of money made by any one individual manufacturer, which completely negates the reason to go manufacture it in the first place. Okay, companies don't make things just to give them away. You still have to make money in order to pay your staff. Okay, so is the work that staff does, is it valuable? Then we should pay for it. Okay, so expanding the manufacturing base sounds like a great place to start, but unfortunately it has its problems too. If the many drugs have less than 3 manufacturers, and that's because there's no money in it to the other manufacturers to go into. If you end up with 5 manufacturers, the overall amount of money made by each individual one is reduced, which reduces the incentive to create it in the first place. Then, of course, how much financial support does the state include? INH happens to be provided, flu is as well, but it is provided frequently by the state. TB treatment is frequently run by the Department of Health, which is why this was a pretty easy study to do. And so that means the state actually buys it. Well, if you're New York, a rich state, were you able to get more of the INH supply than, say, Louisiana, which is not a rich state? Well, is that really the best way to distribute the INH? Or should it be by population of TB cases? Now, New York actually does have a very high population of TB cases, so that actually would work out fine there, but it might not if you compare two different, let's say Texas and Oklahoma. You know, Texas has a lot more money than Oklahoma, but the TB populations would be considered about the same. So then, relative to the you know, percentage wise. So then, why should they get it, just because they're richer, or how should that work? Okay, and then when you do have a shortage, how did these health departments deal with it, with the INH shortage? Well, some of them were able to change suppliers. There are only a couple of suppliers, so they were able to change suppliers and improve their overall stock. Although you saw that there still was a, you know, 41% came down to close to 30-day supply and 15% ran out. So you had to do more than just change suppliers. There wasn't enough nationwide. So prioritizing which patients to treat became an issue. Should we treat just those infected and wait on the latent infected patients? How should we do this? Okay, or should we treat the latent infection patients and keep them healthy, and, you know, wait and get back to the sick ones, and use other drugs for the sick ones? You did have other drugs. There are other drugs that you can use with TB. So these were all decisions that had to be made by these health departments. And then that was the third, use the other drugs, you know. Now, with a drug plan, this was pretty, you know, that you could come to some kind of decision that could be justified. But what if you applied this to organs, which is probably one of the areas where shortness of supply definitely is going to be always be a problem, because, you know, if everybody runs out, we can't possibly replace everybody's organs. Okay, so so how do we apply this to organs? Should a rich person have more access to organs than a poor person? Okay, now it might be easy to say no, but the reality is quite the opposite. Okay, you know, then go, so rich versus poor, and then you say prioritize. Well, the sickest, should they really get it? If they are the sickest, is there a point beyond which they're unlikely to recover? How do you decide what sickest means? Okay, so all of these things have to be taken into account when you're trying to answer these questions. I by no means am trying to answer any of these questions completely. I'm pointing out where ethics comes into play, and how the most important thing when you're trying to justify an ethical answer to a question, you have to have facts, and the facts have to be objective when you do this.